Ireland's democracy needs a reset. I wanted to make this video and a public advocacy address by myself, Dr. Cora M. Hi everybody, and I want to thank all who watched my last video where I was still trying to piece together part of the wider story. Unfortunately, I haven't at all figured out. There's some missing pieces in the jigsaw. I now understand much more clearly though how Ireland's democratic fabric, the balance between executive power, judicial oversight and institutional accountability has been quietly but systematically eroded. I speak today not only as an academic researcher who has spent nearly 3 decades studying governance, accountability and organisation integrity, but as someone who has lived the consequences of what happened when a democracy forgets how to listen, when truth tellers are silenced and oversight is dismantled. The broader case, when accountability fails. Under modern democratic theory, the health of a democracy is measured not by how it treats the powerful, but how it protects those who speak out. Yet, in Ireland today, we're witnessing a pattern of suppression, retaliation and procedural manipulation that undermines the very principles in which the state was founded. Recent years have shown that failure to act where there is a duty of care or intent to harm by neglect can constitute wrongdoing not only in personal criminal law but in the governance of the state itself. When public bodies turn a blind eye to wrongdoing, when they penalise or isolate those who disclose it, that omission becomes a collective act of harm. It is an ethical and democratic failure. Breaches of articles and rights, the treatments of truth tellers, whistleblowers, academic protective disclosure makers in Ireland raises serious questions about compliance with the European Union directives and European right protections, notably Article 6, right to a fair hearing, and Article 13, right to an effective remedy of the European Convention on Human Rights. Every day I'm learning about a new article. The EU Whistleblower Protection Directive, I'm familiar with that now, 2019-1937, which Ireland has transformed in a manner that arguably strips away its core safeguards. Article 10, freedom of expression, violated those legitimate disclosures are met, violated where legitimate disclosures are met with retaliation or silencing. Article 14, prohibition of discrimination, breached when those who disclose are treated differently or are deprived of access to justice. Instead of protecting those who act in the public interest, Ireland's current framework penalises and isolates them, often through misuse of process, reputational tax or procedural exhaustion, or many other things besides. We can think of how many other ways you can try and stitch up a whistleblower or a truth teller or an academic researcher who unfortunately stumbles on whistleblowing as an area of interest or an acts of omission, inadvertently stumbles. The very law indeed is intended to safeguard democracy has become a shield for institutional cover-ups. The problem with the Protective Disclosures Act, this is very, very tricky. The Protective Disclosures Amendment Act 2022 was supposed to align Ireland with EU standards. Instead, it has rendered whistleblowing non-justicable, effectively removing judicial oversight and replacing it with a bureaucratic maze that lacks enforceable remedies. Key problems include no direct judicial route for those penalised or dismissed after disclosing wrongdoing, opaque handling by bodies without quasi-judicial authority, excessive discretion granted to the executive branch, weakening separation of powers, absence of trauma-informed support or restorative arbitration for whistleblowers who face retaliation. In practice, this means that serious wrongdoing can be buried while those who speak up are professionally destroyed. As a scholar who has studied governance and accountability for years, I have found it unconscionable that a state would weaken oversight precisely when transparency is most needed. Government interference and the erosion of separation of powers. Recent government interference in the presidential nomination process, including Fine Gael blocking and probably silent blocking of several to preserve the status quo, exemplifies the deeper problem: executive overreach and politicisation of the democratic processes. This is not about party politics, it's about the principle of fairness. When political actors or networks can quietly control nominations or suppress candidacy through informal mechanisms, democracy ceases to be free, it becomes managed. Even more trouble is the removing of judicial oversight from key transparency frameworks, including whistleblower protection. Without the courts to arbitrate fairness, the executive effectively regulates itself, a direct breach of the separation of powers, one of the fundamental principles of the Irish Constitution. The human cost, academic retaliation and institutional cover-ups. As an academic researcher studying organisation accountability, I have experienced firsthand the severe penalisation of those who uncover uncomfortable truths. In Ireland today, there are multiple examples, including my own, where whistleblowers, researchers and civil servants who expose maladministration face professional destruction, exclusion and financial ruin. For example, the Limerick whistleblowers, there was a huge story about that. And there are many, many others that were reported. Like Maurice McCabe, I have found that truth-telling comes at immense personal cost. But unlike him, I do not have legal representation or public support structures robust enough to withstand the horrific institutional retaliation that follows. It was all reported in Primetime Investigates a few years ago. What whistleblowing has done to whistleblowers absolutely ruined their lives. Such patterns of silencing are not isolated instances; they are systemic mechanisms of control facilitated by legislative design. For example, the Act. The need for a democratic reset. Ireland's democracy needs a reset, not in rhetoric, but in structure. Now, these are restore balance. This is what I propose. Other people might have better solutions, and I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm always interested in a better solution than a 60-day interlocutory period for a national election or a democratic review, ensuring a level playing field and restoring public trust. Everybody's saying they're not going to go to the election. There's so many people telling me I'm not voting. I are spoiling their vote. There is a huge erosion of trust, and you can see it unprecedentedly on the street where people are saying we're not going to vote, or we're going to spoil our vote. Judicial review and constitutional reassessment of the current Protective Disclosures Act, which should be deemed, in my opinion, but I have no control over this, unconstitutional for its breach of fundamental rights and removal of oversight. Creation of an independent arbitration and governance council grounded in law to mediate disputes between citizens, the state and institutions, ensuring trauma-informed processes and evidence-based outcomes. New whistleblowing legislation aligned with EU and UN standards guaranteeing protection, anonymity and enforceable remedies. Re-establishment of checks and balances between the executive, judiciary and legislature, with mechanisms to prevent silent or political interference in constitutional process going forward. Finally, a call for renewal. This is not about one person or one case. It's about the soul of Irish democracy, the right to fairness, accountability and truth. We need a governance reset that values transparency over loyalty, integrity over convenience, and compassion over control. We need to rebuild trust, not through rhetoric, but through lawful, trauma-informed, and ethically sound systems that protect the public interest. I may not have the resources of powerful institutions, I guarantee you I don't, or the legal teams that others have, but I have something equally valuable, a great brain, blessed with a brilliant brain, thankfully, but also, more importantly, a commitment to truth, justice and democratic renewal. Closing, to everyone who has stood by me, supported me, watched these videos, each and every one of you, and shared your own stories, thank you. This is not the end of the story. It is the beginning, hopefully, of Ireland's democratic reawakening. Together, we can ensure that silence and neglect are never again used as instruments of harm, and that those who act in the public's interest are honoured, not destroyed. So thank you all very much for listening, and we wait with bated breath for the judgment of the particular judge in question, and I assume, with the oversight of the judicial review list under the guardianship of the current president of the Irish High Courts. Thank you very much.